Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the Democratic View. I'm the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano, and with me today I have a doctor, but not the kind of doctor you think about as a doctor. He's a doctor of public health, and he is going to tell us about some of the things that are going on in our planet that we all have to pay attention to. His name is Dr. Michael McDonald. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here with you again.
It's wonderful to have you because I think a lot of people are not quite as aware as they should be. So it's all yours.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start with my personal experience and when I began to become aware of climate change and other issues that are complicating the situation for humanity going forward. So I was an undergraduate doing an honors major at University of California, San Diego, and Jonas Salk, he had a personal philosopher that came to some of the programs that I was running on called Faces of Healing, looking at healthcare from all around the world. And so I was brought in to see Jonas, who is the inventor of the polio vaccine.
Yes.
But he introduced me to a group called the EPIC B group. And the Salk Institute at that time had the most amount of Nobel Prize winners in the life sciences in the world. But he was focusing not only on the biology, which was the primary of the element of the first phase of the Salk Institute, but he was also looking at the future evolution of our humanity going forward, what kind of challenges we would be facing in the 21st century. And so he brought me into a group which were CEOs of corporations and heads of NGOs, the head of UNICEF, ministers of different countries and so on, and eminent scientists of different kinds. And they had two quirks. One was that they all had looked at the world models of what was going to happen in the decades forward, given the trajectory of population and energy and economics and so on. And they all were concerned that if we continued on the same trend, then we would see catastrophic drops in population in the 21st century. So the other quirk that they had was they all believed that that wasn't absolutely necessary, that we're called Homo sapiens sapiens, which is supposedly the wise ones. So we had the ability to anticipate and change the trajectory of how humanity was going. And so there was for years, debates over these kinds of issues. And I was in my 20s, most of them were in their 60s and 70s and at the top of their game. So I listened very carefully, but it was all quite distant from my personal experience. I grew up on the Long Island Sound, about 20 to 30 feet from the seawall of the Sound in the Thimble Islands, Stony Creek. And at that time, we had seen lots of changes through the years. The first thing that I noticed was that the eelgrass was beginning to recede. So that was something I could see as a change. But I was really still, for maybe a decade or two, having a hard time seeing the data that would prove that we were really going into challenges in terms of overpopulation and the effect on climate and all of the cascading effects from that. But in the EPIC B group, we looked at the trajectory of human population, and when I started with Jonas in the late 1970s, we were in the range of about 5.5 billion people on the planet, but now we're pushing 8 billion, and we're adding another billion people every 30 years or less now. So we're seeing this exponential growth, and the concern that they were looking at was that we would overextend carrying capacity and we would have catastrophic drops in population. And I didn't really have much experience with that, other than about when I was in my 30s, I think, I saw the first king tide in Stony Creek. where the Long Island Sound actually rose up about 2 to 3 feet, covered the bottom floor of our house, because our house was built in the 1600s, so it was right on the a ledge next to the ocean. And since then, every year now, we've been having floods in the bottom of the floor for the last decade or two now. And that's going to get a lot worse. We're going to, if the projections are correct, add at least 10 inches to 12 inches in the next 30 years. So it's going to go underwater almost all of the time in that house, for example. But then I was traveling around the world, and I had taken a company public, so I had the resources to just focus on some of these issues about the crises that were coming down the pike and how societies and communities were beginning to adapt to those kinds of problems. So, for example, I have gone into several hurricanes. Most recently, I worked with the Prime Minister of Dominica in the Caribbean. I met with him at the UN General Assembly right after they got hit, and went in by helicopter from another island because you couldn't get into the island. They had significant social unrest. They had thousands of people in the streets with cutlasses, and they just took everything out of the stores. The looting was very bad, for example. And I had gone to Dominica earlier, about 5 months earlier, and talked with them about the upcoming hurricane season and said, you really have got to be prepared. I met with the Kalinago, for example, which is one of the first people of the Caribbean, the only indigenous population that have their own territory still in the Caribbean. And they wanted to make the changes, but they didn't really have the resources to make the changes. So I was flying in over the island with the Prime Minister's sister, because all the roads were destroyed. We couldn't get to the Atlantic side of the island, and there was barely a leaf on the island. It looked like winter in a rainforest, a tropical rainforest, and everything was destroyed. 95% of the houses were either severely damaged or destroyed. All the electrical systems were knocked out for a year and a quarter, and so on. And many of the people watching the show probably know what happened to Puerto Rico, but it hit with much more severe winds in Dominica. So at any rate, I was brought back in right after the hurricane.
And what year was that?
That was 2017.
Yeah.
And we began to put in solar lights throughout the island, especially in the shelters, because there was no light in the island for months on end, and over a year and a quarter in a portion of the island where the Kalinago were. So long story short, they lost all of their infrastructure, no water systems, no sanitation systems, the housing destroyed, no electricity. And I've been through several disasters like that around the world, plus a nuclear plant meltdown in Japan and a tsunami in the Indian Ocean basin and so on. So I've been looking at all of these disasters and looking at how can we adapt to climate change and other problems that are coming from overpopulation, overextending the carrying capacity of the Earth, which is happening very quickly now. We're beginning to see the cascading effects, including the issues of militarism. When you get levels of social crisis, when the political economy becomes non-viable, as it is now, for example, for Russia going forward, they're completely dependent upon the petroleum economy.
Wow.
And so, unfortunately, it's changing the political and social dynamics of nations and of communities.
That's amazing. Absolutely. So, so that whole area is very much affected by the climate change that's going on?
Well, in the sense that Russia doesn't really have much of an economy other than its petroleum assets. And as the United States and Europe are shifting toward renewable energy, they do not have a diverse economy. So Putin is choosing a time in which he's trying to make his play to try to maintain Russia as a dominant great power. And unfortunately, there's a great price for being paid by the Ukraine and Europe, and the United States will be affected as well.
You know, when Joseph Stalin ruled Russia, it was quite a different story than the present situation that they have now. And they had such control over everything, over everything. As a matter of fact, Stalin is responsible for the death of probably, well, I know millions of people.
Yeah.
They say 25 million people. I mean, it's really, the history of Russia is, it's unbelievable. They may have produced the greatest writers I know, and I love them. You know, Dostoevsky, nobody can beat him, but holy mackerel, what a history, what a incredible area. And they have wielded so much power. Yeah. And that's what we see now with this whole, you know, Putin and Ukraine situation, which may affect us as a nation as well. And it's somehow or other, I want to say, doesn't that guy know about climate change? Doesn't he understand anything about what's going on in our planet? But I don't think he does. I don't think he understands any of it.
Well, I think that he understands the issues of Russia as a great power in his mind, in his conception of that. And that is dependent upon their ability to maintain a petroleum political economy, which is now threatened. So the concern that we have is going forward, we have CO2 and other greenhouse gases. Methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas, which is exacerbated by fracking. And at this point, the CO2 levels and other greenhouse gases are going up exponentially, and that is directly related to the heating of the planet. With the heating of the planet, for example, if you look at the Atlantic Ocean around the Caribbean, where we have the worst of the hurricane belt, the ocean is rising, the temperature is rising 1 to 2 degrees, and the amount of energy that is contained in the ocean at that time, when it's hottest, creates these enormous vacuum cleaners called hurricanes, which were designed to help balance out the heat of the Earth. And unfortunately, they do their job in terms of some levels of equilibrium with the heat, taking out the heat, but it destroys anything that's fragile along the way, forests and houses and water systems and energy systems and so on. So that's going up, while also we're beginning to see sea level rise. Now, I said over the next 30 years, it's expected in the moderate level of the projections to be about 10 to 12 inches. But 10 to 12 inches, when you start adding on more severe storms, you have catastrophic effects on coastal communities. In addition, you've got heating effects. So in this century, we're going to see Mojave Desert-like conditions for periods of time during the year, extended periods of time, throughout probably 30–40% of the United States. So the southern and southwest states especially are really going to get hit hard. That means that we're talking, even within the United States, millions of people are going to be climate refugees. So we have to figure out, how are we going to balance these kinds of changes? Now, there are ways that we can do some things to balance this. We've got tens of millions of people that are now stateless. They're migrating out of their own countries because it's becoming less viable within the places that they had grown up, and they're seeking other places that will be more viable.
So that Central America, essentially.
Haiti, Venezuela, a lot of the where the societies are beginning to fail, people are moving out. They have to. They're looking for a future for themselves and for their children. And the United States was one of the places historically that they've been able to have as refugees, a place to land and make a life for themselves. But that's now changing. And even within the United States, how are we going to accommodate the people that are impacted from climate change, from, let's say, Florida? About a huge portion of Florida is going to go underwater over the next century.
Oh, I know that. Yeah.
So in the Northeast, luckily, we're in a relatively good position compared to most places, but it's still going to be impacted.
Well, I mean, all this population is also going to be coming and moving in this area. We know even right now that there are, for instance, many Ecuadorians that have come here into Long Island that weren't here before.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to Jonas Salk and the Epic B group for a moment, because we talked about their concern about having this rise in population, exponential rise, overextending carrying capacity, meaning people didn't have enough food, the water systems were being overextended, the global sinks, environmental sinks in the atmosphere, for example, with CO2, but also the waste that's going into the oceans and into the soil. All of those things have not been managed appropriately. But in the Epic B group, they were looking at how do we bring that into balance? How do we change the values of humanity in societies and communities to come into balance? Now, one of the interesting things in the East End, in the bucolic bioregion, is that there is a series of movements now to move toward more balance, like drawdown, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with drawdown.
I am, yes, a little bit, yes.
Okay. So we're now seeing hundreds of people meeting. The last meeting, I think there were about 600 people from the East End that are connected to thousands of people who are getting the message about drawing down the carbon levels and all the things that we can do to actually bring our own communities into balance.
So, right now, though, I'm wondering, what is your prediction for the future of this planet? What is going to happen here with all of this going on?
Well, after about 2 years meeting with Jonas Salk and with the Epic B group, I kind of got up my courage to ask him, well, Jonas, do you believe that we can actually bring this into balance at the global level? And he was quiet for a moment. He said, well, I'm not optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic. We need to act as if we can make the crucial difference. And I said, well, okay, how long do we have? And this was about 1980 now. He said, probably about 15 years to bring it into balance at the global level without having very serious impacts. So we're now 1.5 billion people past what was the time in which we should have been bringing it into balance. So we have consequences at this point. And in some places on Earth, serious consequences. So one of the things that we're looking at is how do we figure out ways in which we can build communities that are both resilient and regenerative. And
explain the word regenerative, because I'm not sure that people know exactly what you mean by that.
okay.
And resilient, we can all understand, that's pretty a common term for people to understand, but regenerative is not.
Yeah. Well, probably the best way to think about regeneration is that we can't, let's say in Miami, just build bigger walls now to keep the ocean out, because it's actually built out of coral, so the sea level will rise up through the coral base. So adaptation is not sufficient. We actually have to begin to regenerate the ecosystems that we live in so that they are producing the ecosystem services, the food, clean water, and all the other things that are necessary for us and all the species that make up our ecosystem to be balanced and can live effectively. So we need to be able to regenerate our ecosystem. So for example, on the East End, we have 20-something communities in the East End, and we need to start figuring out not only how we create more resilience from sea level rise and bigger storms, but we're now working on how can we make the food systems more sustainable. Because one of the big problems is with viruses and bacteria, as the temperature rises, the pathology, the pathogenicity of those pathogens, like COVID, for example, and cholera, begin to get worse, meaning that they're more harmful to humans. And how do we actually manage the process of the ecosystems as they're being damaged by more heat? Some of it is we have to actually work with new species of plants to reforest. That would be a regenerative process, is to help nature begin to regain its capacities. So bring back the biodiversity in some areas, for example.
So how are we doing on that? How's it going?
We got a long ways to go. The good news is that we know elements of what we have to do now, and a lot of people are wanting to go in the right direction. But there's a difference between, for example, about 85% of the people believe that there is climate change now, which is a big change from a decade or two ago. But the leadership, which are mostly old white men in Congress and in the White House, are still not moving forward as quickly as we need to move it. So one element of the change is what can we do from the top down, setting new rules, new laws, new policies. But another element of it is how do we change the culture of our communities? How do we use civic organizations to create a unity of effort that changes the culture? So what do we do ourselves with renewable energy? How do we manage water differently? What do we do in terms of the waste that we produce? How could we compost, for example, the materials to reduce what goes into the landfills and so on?
Well, do you really think that people are aware of this kind of stuff? That they have to do things like compost?
Not enough, but that's what drawdown is, and that's what the East End Resilience Network is about. And that is also what we're doing with the Resilient American Communities Initiative. So over the last 2 years, we've now built over 800 Resilient American Communities sites around the United States, some in all of the states. And we're shooting for 10,000 by 2025. So these are communities that we're designing to become resilient and regenerative with social equity, to live within the carrying capacities of their ecosystems at the local level and at the bioregional level. So a bioregion is like the Bucolic bioregion, the east end of Long Island, which, by the way, we're very lucky to have significant ecosystem services still, like the fisheries, for example.
Yes.
But we're not producing enough food here to feed our populations, especially in the wintertime. We're not designed for that, but we can begin to make that change.
So what's happening is really, for instance, fishing cannot be sustained in the wintertime because it's the shore where people go out to do the fishing, and it gets frozen, and they can't really get out there. Well, because that's one of my questions. With all of this that's going on, is the temperature of the land changing?
Yeah. Well, so especially terrestrial food production is really insufficient. We should be, for example, now building geothermal greenhouses throughout the East End because we've now have a larger population in the wintertime since the pandemic, and we really have not compensated for that. So one of the efforts that we're working with is the East End Food Institute is beginning to bump up the food production capacity, and we're looking to extend that significantly further, for example. But we need more farms. We need a different kind of marine food production because the fisheries are changing and they're actually collapsing in lots of parts of the world. The fish that were here 30 years from now are quite different than the dominant fish species now. That's changing rapidly, and it's going to change much more.
Well, so far you've painted quite a bleak picture of our future. So we're going to hope that the next time we have you on the show, you will be able to help us think about how we can save our lives and our area. Thank you very much for coming today. It's been terrific.
Thank you. It's been
we'll
great
have
to be with you.
Again.
But